to, I'll just take some notes right here. Essentially what we're doing is we're finding the representative portion of the data, right? And we said that can mean things like finding more recent data, making sure that if we're using a grouping or more recent data, if we have like a grouping, make sure we have a substantial portion of that group, right? Because we have to worry about our whole missing data bias, right? The fact that oftentimes the missing data does not look like our data overall. It could be data that's harder to get. It could be individuals that don't want to respond. It could be places that don't have the resources to respond. Things like that. So what we need to do is just find the portion of the data that's we actually have a substantial portion of it and try to identify and fill in, if we can, some of the missing data there. From there, once we do that, then we can do like a bit of data cleaning. One thing we talked about was like the add date part, right? To get a bunch of different, be able to segment this by day, month, etc. But then also basically just coerce data from objects in pandas or strings in Python to numbers, to numerical/datetimes. Okay. And then from there, what we did was basically said, all right, we can do our data exploration. And the technique for that is one, identify a target, meaning what do you want to optimize? Which is typically like revenue or profits, right? But it can be other things. Like for the SAT scores, right, is our SAT scores. And then the other thing is just, okay, what are the components that contribute to this target, right? If it's, revenue, what are the components that contribute to it? And we said there's kind of like two different stages here. One is we can do like 80-20 analysis, which typically, if I can spell it, I don't think I can, analysis, involves, group bys, okay? We can do this by the product or the geography, right? The branch. We can do it by the time period, for example, like the weeks, like which weeks, or the time period meaning like the hour, for example. And then also just like what's interesting or like unexpected differences in the data, right? Meaning that, okay, if we notice that typically, right, these weeks are doing very well, but maybe it's not happening in our most popular branches. Like, why is that? So for something like this, with our 80-20 analysis, what we can do is select that subset, right, the portion that's most relevant, and then just perform more group bys on that subset. So if it's the products that's most relevant, select that portion of the data set involving those products, and then see where are they sold, when are they sold, etc. So just kind of dig deeper. So for this next, we'll practice doing that. But one thing just to point out, and what this reading covers, is just that you can do that with users, kind of on the transactional level as well, right? So here it's a little bit different in terms of the steps, but the thought process is the same. Here what I'm doing, right, I'm loading up some data. We have, in this case, just transactions, that people have made. And one thing that you may want to do is just figure out who are your top users, right? And the reason why I'm kind of giving a separate topic for this is you might think there could be like thousands of users. So figuring out the top ones is a little different, may feel a little different, but actually like the process is very similar. So here what I'm doing, I'm just quickly transforming the data, trying to get into numbers as much as possible. And then the next step, so you can see I converted things into numbers. Then the next step is you can still use this build group by function, actually, that we used previously. Let me just show you it. It should be here. I just don't know if it will open. We can look at it here. So right, we're grouping by the column. In this case, it will be like the user ID, and then aggregating on like summing up, and this would be the target, right? Which would be like the revenue that you're making. So it'd be like group by, all the users' transactions, group by that user ID, and then sum up how much revenue are we getting per user, right? And then from there, maybe we can identify the top users. So that's what's happening here, right? It's that same process of this is the percentage per user of this user. It's very small, right? It's a 1/3 of 1%. But what's good still is that we can, if we do the cumulative percentage, and then what I did was I plotted it. Basically, I'm plotting, this is the X is the percentage of users. So it goes from 0 to 1. Right? And then the Y is the percentage of spend. So you can see once I get to 30% of my user base, we're already spending 80% or getting 80% of the revenue. The reason why I'm plotting it is because you can have kind of different thresholds, right? Like, for example, less than 10% of the users account for the top 50% of revenue. So just in itself, by the way, I did not change this data set at all, right? I just kind of assumed that this might be occurring. So just identifying the top users in general is kind of an interesting finding, right? Because it means, you can give those users some sort of preference, right? Like airline miles type of deal, type of thing, right? Or just you want to make sure, even if it's just like customer support or just making sure that you don't lose those users, just this analysis in itself is probably interesting to, stakeholders. But then from there, we can do our same kind of component, which is select the portion of the data that's, moving the dial, and then do a deeper dive into that. So for this, what this looks like is, select the users who account for less than 80%, right? And the top 80% of this cumulative percentage, right? So once we hit that, and you can see that what I'm doing is I'm saying these are my power users. And so it's 20,000 users of 65,000 total, right? Account for, so like 1/3, less than 1/3 is accounted for 80% of the revenue. Now, in order to do a deeper dive of this information, it may feel it's a little bit tricky, because let me just show you what I have to do. So here's the power users that we identified, right? And this came from grouping by. But if I want to do a deeper dive, basically on my data, right, all I have are these columns right now. I need to go back to my transactions. Here, let me show you. Right, these are the transactions that each user spent on. So what I want to do is I want to identify just those transactions from these customers here. Okay? So how do I do that? The way that there's different ways, but the ways I decided to do it was I'm just taking the transactions and I'm just going to set the index here equal to the customer ID. Okay? So that's what I'm doing in this line. I'm saying the updated transaction index equals the customer ID. Then once you do that, right, so now I'm reset the index. Once we do that, then I can take those power users, right? These are the power users I identified. These are the customer IDs, and use the loc function to, right? The loc works with a matching on the index. So I can take, you can kind of see it. I can basically say, here, this has all my transactions. Okay, but what I want to do is use the loc function to only pass through a list of the customer IDs from the power users. So it'll be something like this, right? We'll do .loc and then pass through the power users df .customer ID, right? So only all those transactions involving this set of customers. And now that will be data frame object has no. This will be .index. I guess it's not called customer ID. Yeah, it's called .index here. So I can just do this, .index, and now we're getting a subset of the data. So here's 19,000 rows. Originally, we had .shape. Originally, we had 65,000 rows. Okay? So these are just with my top users, right? Like that less than 1/3 of the users. And now this can be like basically your selected data frame. I just want to make sure I'm doing it properly. I also selected those transactions that were non-power users, but these are now my power user transactions, right? So it's just going to be like that subset of the data involved involved with my power users. Sorry, I just have to run the code. And obviously the reading takes you through this. But the idea is, now that we've identified, kind of applied the 80/20 analysis, selected those transactions with my top customers, then we can do our old trick of basically grouping by each column and seeing what do these power users look like, in the aggregate, like typically. Meaning, what products do they buy, when do they shop, where are they from, etc., etc. Okay? And the reason why I separated out, right, the non-power users as well is you don't want to be like, well, we kind of talked about this before, right? Oh, our power users happen to be from Washington. And it's like, well, all of your users happen to be from Washington, right? So that's the reason why I'm separating out the non-power users, so we can compare any findings from my power users versus the non-power users. So then what's involves is basically just using our build and print function again, but only this time doing it on the power users subset, right? The transactions from our power users, but then just doing the same thing, same kind of analysis. I have to, for whatever reason, I guess I have to move it in here, but that's the idea. And then you can just plot it, see what they look like and compare it versus what the non-power users look like, and kind of, that would be an interesting finding, is here's what our power users look like. And they differ from our overall users. They tend to be younger. They tend to be from this area. They tend to shop at these times, right? Here they tend to buy these products. Okay, so that's the process here. The code, in terms of the code, the only really tricky part is that, once I identified the power users, right? Once I have identified the power users, I then selected that list and use that list to identify those transactions involving the power users. Just feel okay? I know, I think that, I wouldn't expect you to be able to get all this without the reading as well, but do the strokes of this feel okay? Or questions about this? Right, so just to recap, the idea is, do the group by on the transactions, and we're grouping by the customer ID. From there, we can, perform 80/20 analysis and use the cumulative sum, okay? And on the x-axis, right, is my percentage of users. On the y-axis is total amount kind of brought in. And you can see that right at 80% of the revenue, that involves 30% of the users. So then the next step is, well, find those who are these 30% of the users? What are their IDs? So that's what we do next, right? Just select here up to 80%, and that gives me 30% of the users. And then the next step is, well, sure, we have these users, but what we want to know is what are the activity of these important users, right, or our power users. So what we need to do is go back to our transactions, okay? Go back to the transactions, assign the index to be the customer ID, and then only select those transactions from our power users. That's the idea. All right. Cool. Everything else, and then once you select those transactions, then you can perform the group by the same way, right? And print out, what do they spend their money on? When do they spend it? Where are they? Et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And the only other point is, right, you want to compare that. I'm selecting the power users, but I also found the non-power users. And the way I did that was just this method called difference, right? It's like a set difference. Take the list of power user indices, minus them from all the indices, right? And that gives me the non-power user indices. And that way I can compare power user transactions versus non-power user transactions. So those are the strokes. Those are like kind of the steps that I'm going through here. All right. Cool. So I'll let you look through this unless there's questions on this. We do have like this review lab, which will go through the group by again. It really is the same thing. It's really the same steps. And then power products is the same thing. Like say we have thousands of products, perform 80-20 analysis to find like just the top subset of the products, then see more features about those products. And then this is kind of like a bonus. And then finally we have, of course, like a large lab covering the analysis, of course. All right. Hopefully this is interesting. I'll be